Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure to be discussing with you one of the great concepts of the urinary system. That's right, in the kidneys, as you can see in this diagram right here, that are sort of in posterior in the abdominal cavity, not only are critical in filtering the blood of its metabolic waste. If that isn't enough, and if it isn't enough that they produce a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO for short, that controls the production of red blood cells in the red bone marrow, but they also produce a protein enzyme called renin that helps to raise blood pressure. And so it helps to regulate blood pressure when the blood pressure is getting a little bit low. And so that's what this particular video is going to be a discussion about, which is the production of this protein called renin, and I hope you enjoy it. And so let's get into that. So we're in the kidney, and again, you might be familiar with the kidney in general. We have this medulla area here, and this is the outer cortex. And in the outer cortex, as you can see here, I'll just circle it, outer cortex, we have these interesting structures called nephrons, and there's about 1 million of them. And that's the functional unit of the kidney. And the nephron is really good at filtering out metabolic waste, it removes excess water and sodium, all kinds of things from the body. And so here's another thing that the nephron does. Well, let's get into this brief review of anatomy if you're not familiar with it. The nephron itself is composed of this blood vessel called the afferent arteriole, which blood is then coming in like this. And what happens is that it branches up into a big tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus. It's really a big ball like this. And the blood's coming in under high pressure. And then the blood exits out like this in an efferent arteriole. Meanwhile, and I'm not going to draw all the detailed structure, meanwhile there's a renal capsule that surrounds the glomerulus, sometimes known as the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. And then what you have is the beginning of the renal tubule. And so all the filtrate is coming into this renal tubule. And this thing is kind of convoluted like that, proximal convoluted renal tubule. And then it dips down into the medulla in what's known as the loop of Henle, right in here. And then it comes back up like this, and it sort of weaves around like this. And this is referred to as the distal convoluted tubule. And then this will actually branch off into collecting ducts, which will then service, let me just do this, will service other nephrons like that. And I'll just draw it like this, like branches of a tree. And then ultimately this collecting duct comes down the renal pelvis, the renal pyramids into the renal pelvis, and then out the ureters and stored in the urinary bladder. So this is the production of urine. And so this particular conversation that I'd like to have with you about the production of renin, that protein, has to do with this particular region right here in the nephron. And so there's a cool thing happening right at the sort of fork in the road between the afferent and efferent arteriole and the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted renal tubule. This area right here is what I'd like to get into the conversation about. And so, as you may know, that this whole area is called the renal corpuscle, and it's the part of the, as I mentioned, the part of the nephron that does a great job filtering. So all this glomerular filtrate is going in here. So small things like out of the plasma, so water, urea, various salts, glucose, and then all of that goodness can then be reabsorbed in the peritubular capillary network which surrounds the renal tubule. So here's perhaps a better drawing of the detail of the nephron. Here you can see the renal corpuscle. Here's the Bowman's capsule, the glomerulus. You have your afferent arteriole coming in, your efferent, and then the peritubular capillary network surrounds the renal tubule so that you can have maximum reabsorption of the filtrate back into the blood. Okay, just a little orientation. So I'm going to hang out on this diagram for a little bit because this area that I want to talk to you about. In that area in the white box that I drew just a second ago, you ready for this? This is a cool word. Juxtaglomerular apparatus. And so The juxtaglomerular apparatus is the region when the blood is coming in. Let me see if I can animate this. Let's go here. So the blood's coming in, the afferent arteriole, and it's coming in right here. And just like any other arteriole, it's composed of this endothelium, simple squamous material, and then there's some smooth muscle that surrounds the arterioles. And the smooth muscles are important because those can constrict or they can dilate. And so as it turns out, what holes in between the afferent and the efferent arteriole, there's a bunch of cells in between sort of providing structure, and those are called mesangial cells. These mesangial cells are structural, and they're located right here. This is a cutaway cross-section of the distal convoluted tubule right there. And these cells in particular, they sort of look elongated, are called the macula densa cells. And those are going to become important in our conversation. Some of the cells, the smooth muscle cells that surround the afferent arteriole, have little tiny granules inside of them. They're shown here in green. They're not really green, but they're really emphasized in green. They contain these little granules called renin, and this is the protein that I wanted to discuss, which helps to lower the blood pressure. And so those cells are called granular because they contain little granules in them. They're called juxtaglomerular cells, or JG cells for short. So juxtaglomerular apparatus is really this whole region right here comprising the juxtaglomerular cells of the afferent arteriole and the macula densa cells. So this whole area is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And this region right here is really important in producing renin, which is helping to lower blood pressure. Helping to raise blood pressure. And so what's cool about it is the word juxtaglomerular, meaning sort of like juxtaposed. It's sort of opposite that of the glomerulus right over here. So it's juxtaglomerular apparatus. And then again, the blood's coming in here, and it's being filtered by the glomerulus, and the filtrate is entering here in the proximal convoluted renal tubule right over there, if you're familiar with that. Another diagram of this. And so here's the blood coming in like this. So this is your afferent arteriole, and it's coming in like this. And you can see that here's the endothelium cells of the blood vessel. And these cells that are surrounding it right over here that I'm putting my cursor on are the juxtaglomerular cells. And those juxtaglomerular cells are the ones that are producing the protein called renin, which is going to be part of our conversation. So if I were to emphasize them, I would go like this. These are the juxtaglomerular cells right here. And so what are the juxtaglomerular cells? The juxtaglomerular cells are specialized smooth muscle cells that are producing the protein renin, and that protein is the one that's going to be helping to raise your blood pressure. And so that's what they're located. They're interesting because they're modified smooth muscle cells, and so but they're capable of doing more than just contracting. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So I like this diagram a lot too because it shows like a really nice image of an arteriole. So here's the arteriole coming in right there. Here's your ordinary smooth muscle cells, and then these cells right here are the juxtaglomerular cells right in here, which are going to be producing the protein called renin. Okay, and then here's the cutaway of the distal convoluted tubule, and these cells right here are the macula densa cells right over here, which is all part of the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, so that's what we're focusing our attention on. So this is a drawing that I made of this process, and so let's see if we can identify this. So here is the blood coming into the afferent, so it's coming into the renal corpuscle, which is not shown here in the glomerulus. So the blood's coming in like that, and what's interesting is when the blood comes in like this, this is the afferent arteriole, so this is the endothelium cells. These are your typical smooth muscle cells here and here. And then these cells are the juxtaglomerular cells, or the JG cells. And inside here, they contain these little granules. and sometimes they're just called granular cells. But those little green dots are the protein renin that will be secreted when necessary into the bloodstream. And so the question is that we have is what's causing renin production? There's a couple of different triggers that are going to cause renin to be released into the bloodstream. And you're like, well, you mentioned it when the blood pressure is low, but we want to look at the detail of that. And again, here's the cross section of the distal convoluted tubule, and here's the macula densa cells. This is the efferent arteriole over there. So collectively, this region is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Okay, one last diagram of this, just a different picture so that you can sort of get a sense of it. Here the blood is coming in. Here are the JG cells right here. Mesenchymal cells are right here. Here's the macula densa cells here. Here are the capillaries, which are surrounded by the podocytes, which are helping to prevent them from bursting because the blood's under high pressure. And then the filtrate cruises through, and then it is travels into the proximal renal tubule. So our conversation is going to be focused again right over here. This is the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is made of the JG cells, right, juxtaglomerular cells, which are going to release renin, which are located mostly on the afferent arteriole, and these macula densa cells are going to become important as well. So let's take a look at that. So here's, I mentioned one more diagram if that's okay with you. So here's the whole picture of the nephron, and here's the afferent arteriole coming in. Here's your juxtaglomerular cells, which are producing the renin, and here again are the macula densa cells, so the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And so one of the key functions of the kidney, in addition to, if it wasn't enough, again, to producing EPO or removing metabolic waste, is that it produces this very important protein called renin. And this is actually a picture of it. It's a rather large protein. This is using X-ray crystallography and computer enhanced. These are alpha helix and beta pleated sheet. So this is the tertiary structure of the protein. Now, renin is considered to be an enzyme. And an enzyme we often like to end with the name ACE. And so it's called angiotensinogen ACE. Angiotensinogen ACE. That's a mouthful, right? So I'm going to mention that the angio, which stands for like blood vessel, like artery. Angiotensin, meaning to make an artery or an arterial tense. Tensinogen is a precursor. And so what it's going to do ultimately is convert this inactive compound into an active one. And so it's going to act as an enzyme doing that. And that's ultimately going to increase blood pressure. And that's going to be our conversation. Okay? So I thought I'd include this light microscope picture of what the juxtaglomerular cells really look like. And so like here's one right in here. And as you can see, it has all of these little tiny granules inside, and that's the renin inside. That's the enzyme that we were just talking about, located inside the cell itself. And again, this is on the outer wall of the afferent arteriole. These are the endothelium, the simple squamous cells, right there. So it's a modified smooth muscle cell that's in the kidney that secretes the enzyme renin. And that's going to be important in raising blood pressure. And so I mentioned there's a couple of reasons that the juxtaglomerular cells would secrete renin. So what are the triggers that would cause the juxtaglomerular cell? Here it is right here. And as you can see in this, there's these little red dots. And so these are these little granular cells, if you will. Sometimes they're literally called granular cells. They're going to be releasing renin into the arterial lumen, in other words, into the blood. So renin is going to be going into the blood. And you're like, well, what's causing the cell? What's causing this cell to secrete that into the blood? Let's look at that. The number one cause would be that in the lumen of the afferent arteriole, this is my drawing of that, when blood pressure is low, that just literally means that there's going to be less physical push on the walls of the blood vessel. And so these JG cells can detect, they have pressure sensitivity. They can literally detect through little receptors the fact that there's little push. And so the blood pressure is low. And so when they detect low blood pressure, that is what causes them to secrete those little granules of renin into the bloodstream. And so here they are going into the bloodstream. And so the question that you might be having is, at this point is, well, how does renin increase blood pressure? I will mention that. I will try to describe it. I'm just talking about what are the triggers that would cause the JG cells to release renin, not what renin does in particular. But I'll get into that. So the first one is the JG cells physically detect the low pressure physically. And then I mentioned that these macula densa cells are going to be really important. And so this is the second trigger. What's interesting about this is that one of the functionalities of the kidney is to reabsorb sodium and to urinate out sodium. And so in this tube, there's sodium ions right in here. There's sodium ions. And as it turns out, the macula densa cells, right, located here, can detect the presence of sodium. And if they detect a low concentration, if they sense that there's low sodium in the distal convoluted renal tubule, if the concentration of sodium is low, they perceive that as meaning, hey, there's low blood pressure. And they do that because perhaps the reason that there's low sodium inside the renal tube is because perhaps the whole nephron isn't getting a lot of blood pressure. In other words, if there's not a lot of pressure in the glomerulus, that means that there's not a lot of sodium being reabsorbed. And so therefore the sodium levels are a little bit low. And so it might mean that the filtration pressure is a little bit low. And so these cells pick that up by detecting sodium. It's kind of clever. So let me repeat that. So by having low sodium in the tube, they indirectly interpret that as low blood pressure. And their response to that is that they produce a little chemical messenger which travels a very short distance. It goes from the macula densa cells to the juxtaglomerular cells. And we call chemical messengers that travel a short distance prostaglandins. And so these chemical messengers will initiate, prostaglandins, will initiate and tell the JG cells to secrete renin. And so that's what's going to happen when there's low sodium in the distal convoluted tubule. And then the third and final trigger to releasing of renin is one of the nervous system. Now, the way I drew this afferent arterioles, I didn't draw all the detail because you know that there's a couple of tunics or a couple of layers to a blood vessel. There's the intima, which is the simple squamous right in here, endothelium, and then there's the smooth muscle. But then there's the outer layer as well, and that's made up of connective tissue. And so let me just draw that in here like that. And then you might also know that sometimes there's nerves that will terminate on the outside of blood vessels. That's right. It will terminate like this. And so I'm drawing the axon terminal. And so under the sympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system could influence and raise blood pressure because a nerve impulse can come down and literally cause the JG cells to release renin into the bloodstream. And so it's under nervous system control, and macula densa cells are also controlling that, and then physical pressure. So there's three triggers to releasing the renin. Now, I want to get into a discussion about what renin is doing to raise blood pressure, because what we're trying to do is raise blood pressure. And so this conversation is something referred to in physiology as the RAAS system. So that, to spell it out, it's RAAS. The RAAS is an acronym for renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Now, aldosterone is a hormone that is produced by the adrenal glands, which are two glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and in particular in the cortex of the kidney releases this hormone aldosterone, and aldosterone affects blood pressure. Angiotensin affects blood pressure, and renin affects angiotensin. And so I want to get into this conversation because what we're trying to do, big picture, is to raise blood pressure. So how does it all work? Well, what's fascinating is that it's not just in the kidney, and it's not just in the adrenal gland. There's some other interesting places we're going to talk about that are involved in this. One of them is in the brain and the pituitary gland, and the other one's the liver. So let me start off with the liver. So renin, I just want to point out that renin, I've been talking about it a lot, those little green balls that are released from the JG cells. They're technically a protein. Renin is technically an enzyme because it speeds up the conversion of, what it does is it converts angiotensinogen into something called angiotensin 1. And so renin, let me just stay with that idea for a second. So renin is an enzyme that will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Okay, so that's what it's doing. So it's an enzyme. So I draw it like that. So it's speeding up the conversion. But sometimes it's referred to, although not completely wrong, but it's referred to as a hormone, because what a hormone does is it's a chemical messenger that travels from one location in the bloodstream, and that's what renin does, and it acts kind of in a location further away, and that's kind of what renin does. And so it's a hormone-like enzyme. Let's just I'll split it right in the middle there. Hormone-like enzyme. And so what is it doing? Well, in the liver, now the liver does so many things, but one of the things that it does is that it has these liver cells, and they're sort of cuboidal. Here, I'll draw them in. And here's a blood vessel, lots of blood vessels in the liver, obviously. They secrete, the liver cells, they secrete a very large protein. And I'm going to draw a protein like this. I'm going to say a protein is made up of a chain of amino acids like this. So it's a polypeptide, and it's hundreds of amino acids in length. Okay, and so if you were to look this up, it's exactly 452 amino acids. And so I want to draw it like this, but then again, this would get ridiculous if I drew in every amino acid. And so sometimes what's shown in a book is that it'll just sort of weave around like this, and it show it three-dimensional like this, and there's bonds holding the whole protein together. Okay, so this big protein, angiotensinogen, this big protein is inactive. In other words, it's not active. So it's sort of like if you're familiar with the protein pepsinogen, which is in the stomach, it doesn't become active unless it's in a acidic environment. And so this is inactive. So this is cruising through our bloodstream, or fibrinogen. It doesn't cause the blood to clot unless it's turned into active fibrin. So fibrinogen is inactive, pepsinogen is inactive, angiotensinogen is inactive, and it's just cruising along. And it's like, well, what's going to make it active? I think you may know. It's the enzyme renin, which is going to convert this inactive protein into an active, or I'll say a more active one, called angiotensin 1. And so this enzyme's going to do it. And you're like, well, what's the enzyme going to do? Well, what the enzyme's going to do is that it's circulating, and it comes from the kidney. And what it's going to do is hydrolyze angiotensinogen. So hydrolyze is a biochemical term meaning it's just going to split it with water. And so it's going to fracture that big protein up into a smaller peptide chain. So it's going to make something from a polypeptide into an oligopeptide called angiotensin 1. And so this is your big fella. So this is an angiotensinogen. This is the 452. And so the enzyme renin, if I can illustrate it, is going to come along right here. This is the renin. I'll put a little R right here. And then, again, this comes from the kidney. Now this could be happening anywhere in the blood, in the body. So it's going to hydrolyze or cut this big portion of the protein away. And what it's going to do is it's going to leave this small fragment of 10 amino acids. And this little area of 10 amino acids is going to be called angiotensin 1. That's what this is. Angiotensin 1 is this part right over here, and this part is going to be released. And what's speeding that up is the enzyme renin. So it cleaves that big piece off. Okay? So you're like, okay, now what's going on? Well, we now have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This little thing cruising around called angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1. It's cruising through the bloodstream. Now, if you were to be reading about this or studying about this RAAS system, most of the older textbooks would say that angiotensin 1 is then further broken down by this. It's further broken down, and I'll illustrate it, by removing 2 of the amino acids and leaving this little 8 amino acid peptide called angiotensin 2, and that's what I'm about to describe. And they would say that that occurs in the lungs, but the truth is it does occur in the lungs, and it occurs in the lungs a lot, but it really happens in every blood vessel in the body, because every blood vessel, and I try to draw a blood vessel here, let me get rid of this. Every blood vessel has this endothelium tissue, and in the membrane of the endothelial cells, the simple squamous cells of blood vessels, is a enzyme, you ready for this, called, so it's endothelium bound enzyme in purple, called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. Okay, so this little guy is called ACE, and this one is ACE, and this one is ACE. And what does the ACE enzyme do? Well, it cleaves this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It takes the 10 of it and it converts it. It cuts off 2 of the amino acids, and it leaves this 8 peptide. And that little 8 peptide, 8 amino acid fragment is called angiotensin 2. And so you're like, whoa. Well, angiotensin 2, this is what it actually looks like. Angiotensin 2, these are 8 amino acids. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And these are the R groups that are coming off the peptide, oligopeptide. These are the actual amino acids that make up angiotensin 2. The point of all of this is that angiotensin 2 is very, 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 very active, which means it's going to be able to raise blood pressure. And so you don't want to raise blood pressure until you really need to. And so the body has these sort of intermediates in order to regulate matters. And so angiotensin 2 is the little tiny, I can't really call it a protein, the little tiny oligopeptide that is going to raise blood pressure, angiotensin 2. And how does it do that? How does angiotensin 2 raise blood pressure? It does it a couple of different ways. One of the ways in which it raises blood pressure, angiotensin 2, is that it's a very potent constrictor of blood vessels. And again, a blood vessel has these endothelium cells like that, but it also has a lot of smooth muscle cells that go around it. And so basically what's happening is angiotensin 2 comes along in the blood, and it will cause these muscle cells to contract. And if they contract, that means that the blood vessel becomes smaller in diameter, and that raises the resistance in the blood vessels, which then physically increases the blood pressure and causes it to rise. So angiotensin 2 will cause your blood vessels to constrict, and that's its function. But it was all implemented by renin, if you recall. Now, angiotensin 2, in addition to it being a great vasoconstrictor, can also act on the adrenal glands. And now, adrenal glands are called adrenal glands because they sit on top of the renal. And so, in other words, they're like little caps for the kidneys. And on the outer part of the adrenal gland is the cortex. Now, these cortex cells, I'll just put them in here, they can take in molecules from the blood, like, for example, in the form of a molecule called cholesterol. And the cortex cells can convert cholesterol, which is a steroid, into another steroid called aldosterone. So aldosterone, this is actually a physical picture of what aldosterone looks like. It looks a lot like cholesterol. But when pressure is low, when blood pressure is low, aldosterone can help raise blood pressure. And you're like, well, wait a minute, how can it do that? Well, angiotensin 2 causes the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. What causes angiotensin 2, angiotensin 1, and then ultimately renin. So this is how it works. Aldosterone, one of its targets is that of the epithelial cells of the kidney. So now we're back in the kidney. So this is really cool. This is a blood vessel here. This is the distal convoluted renal tubule. What aldosterone does is that in the blood, it causes the epithelial cells of the renal tubule to become better at reabsorbing sodium back into the blood. And so let me just do this. You may know, because sodium is a positive ion. It's a positive ion. You're going to need a protein transport for that to take place. And so that's a sodium transport. And so the hormone causes the cells right in here. Now, that's not an individual cell. I can draw individual cells like this. It causes the cell to produce a protein which will facilitate more movement of sodium back into the bloodstream. So this is what aldosterone is doing, is increasing reabsorption. Increasing reabsorption. And you're like, well, what does that have to do with raising blood pressure? What that has to do with raising blood pressure is, you may have guessed it, as the sodium increases in the peritubular capillary network, the blood becomes more hypertonic. And as it becomes more hypertonic, that means that water is going to be able to flow out of the renal tubule into the blood. And if there is an increase of water in the blood, that's going to increase the volume of the blood, which is then ultimately going to increase blood pressure, because more volume, more blood pressure. Now, all of this means that if this is going to occur, that means that the convoluted renal tubule must be permeable to water, and indeed that it is. And it also could mean, if you're following this, because ultimately, let me go with the yellow over here, this means that as the filtrate is traveling through, this is ultimately going to become urine. That means that your urine, if I were to ask you this question, is the urine going to have less sodium in it? And the answer to that is yes. By increasing the sodium in the blood, that means the water is going to go and it's going to increase blood pressure. So that's how aldosterone is working. Now, the detail of that is totally awesome. Okay, so I mentioned here is one cell of the distal convoluted renal tubule. These cells that are right next to the bloodstream are called principal cells, just saying. So this is a totally awesome thing. Those of you who are into this will like the details will like this. And so this protein, as you may know, that moves sodium is called the sodium-potassium pump. And so what can happen is there's sodium obviously in a cell like that, and there's also potassium in the cell. And the reason I bring up both of these is because the sodium-potassium pump will take 3 sodiums like this, 3 sodiums, and put it into the blood like that, and then it will actually shuttle 2 potassiums back into the cell from the blood. It'll bring this in. And all of this is powered by ATP. So you need energy to have this pump to work. And so again, what we're trying to do is push the sodium out there. So let me see if I can emphasize this. So the more sodium potassium pumps, and that's what aldosterone is doing, creating more sodium potassium pumps, more sodium is being put out there. More sodium is being put out there in the blood. And as more sodium is being put into the blood, that means that water, which was in your renal tubule, is more likely to then move back into the blood through osmosis. And again, that increases the volume of the blood, and that also causes, therefore, the blood pressure to rise. But what's really cool about this is to make the sodium potassium pump work even more is that aldosterone also increases just the pure sodium pumps, which will bring more sodium into the cells in the first place from the filtrate, which then it means that it can move more into the bloodstream. And then it will also produce potassium pumps, which will remove potassium over here into the filtrate. And it's like, well, why would it do that? Because by removing potassium into the filtrate, what that's going to do is it's going to attract even more potassium in, and then this way it's going to push more sodium out. So it's helping the sodium potassium pump. But so in so doing, you urinate less sodium and you urinate more potassium. So aldosterone creates an increase of potassium in the urine, increases blood pressure. Awesome. Okay, and now this is, it gets even more, firing up for this. Angiotensin 2, also while circulating, remember this is that little tiny oligopeptide, 8 amino acids. This thing's cruising around the bloodstream, and guess where it goes? It goes to the brain. And in the brain, we have this pituitary gland. There's a little tiny pea-shaped organ, and it has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland makes the hormone antidiuretic hormone, which is ADH. And you're like, ADH can cause reabsorption in the kidney, so it targets the kidney, reabsorption of water into the blood, and it raises blood pressure. And you're like, well, wait a minute, didn't you just describe that with aldosterone? Yes, they do the same thing. They're both trying to reabsorb water into the bloodstream in order to increase blood pressure, but ADH does it a little differently than aldosterone. Aldosterone tries to increase blood pressure by pushing the sodium into the blood, and then the water then follows. What this does, it's really cool. This acts a little bit further down in the renal tubule, a little bit in an area where water is not normally permeable. So further down in the collecting duct, here's your filtrate that's cruising down like this from the nephron, which is located over here. So there's water that's cruising in like this. And you're like, well, these walls in the renal tubule are impermeable. And so normally, under normal conditions, you would just be urinating out water. But say you were dehydrated, which is going to cause low blood pressure, or you wanted to increase your blood pressure. So you want water to go back into the blood. And it's like, well, it can't at this point. Up here it could, in the distal convoluted tubule. That's what I was just describing before in aldosterone, when this is how aldosterone is working up here, because this area is permeable to water. But down here it's not. Oh, but the antidiuretic hormone, guess what it does? The antidiuretic hormone comes in and it causes the cells of the collecting tube, are you ready for this? To create proteins that will allow the transport of water. We never knew that these things existed. We always thought that water simply moved through the plasma membrane through simple diffusion because it's very small. But when measurements were conducted in the kidney, there was just too much reabsorption of water to allow for simple diffusion. There must be some kind of protein facilitating that. And so this protein is called an aquaporon because it's able to move water across the cell membrane extremely rapidly. So if the cells wanted to really quickly move water from the collecting tube back into the bloodstream, you'd want to make a bunch of aquaporons, and that would allow for a lot more water to go in. So more water will translate into increased blood pressure. Does that make sense? And so this is totally awesome because this is under hormonal control. So in other words, if the body wanted to retain water, it can simply produce antidiuretic hormone and the body would reabsorb more water and you would urinate less water. Awesome. And again, finally, the central nervous system, it would be remiss to not mention this, the central nervous system can also increase blood pressure by simply consciously stimulating the body to become thirsty, and therefore you would drink more water and that would increase your blood pressure. And so I hope you enjoyed this look at the amazing RAAS system, all started by the kidney. The kidney rocks. And so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it.